Riddle me this, Tavo. How is it that the second political force in Mexican congressional politics is the PAN, the Partido Acción Nacional, after the sort of governing coalition, and yet it manages to be, by far, the smallest party by number of supporters, registered supporters, in the whole country. Smaller than the smallest party, smaller in fact than most parties that aren't even parties yet, they're sort of on the way to become parties. The PAN, just so you get a little bit of an idea, has under 200,000 members versus Morena, the ruling party, which has 12 million. And yet, for some reason, somehow, these folks have managed to get second place in Congress, and they're sort of the main voice for the opposition. They're a massive shambles, we'll probably talk about that later, but they've managed to put themselves in a weird position here. Zero support, from actual supporters, and yet they get the folks to come out and vote for them. How's that happened? I would like to put it to you that it's because of the way the party was founded almost, 90 years ago? And basically, it's all down to one man and the way he created this very weird way of doing politics in the post-revolutionary era. And that's why I'd like to call, maybe controversially, Manuel Gómez Morín Mexico's first post-revolutionary technocrat.
So you've jumped ahead a little bit there in Manuel Gómez Morín's life, because no doubt, possibly the most important thing that he does during his life is to create the PAN. This is the loyal opposition, as it were, for the better part of the PRI's, the PRI's time in government. This is all the way to the year 2000. And it's the party that takes over when the PRI falls. Doesn't fall, it's still around, but it loses power, let's say, in the year 2000. Up until not too many years ago, equivocally, one of the most important forces in politics all around, just by seats, not just by followers, but just a massively important political party.
They mattered.
Past tense, indeed. But the thing about Manuel Gómez Morín is that he has an incredibly illustrious career. The first sort of memory I have of Manuel Gómez Morín sticking in my head isn't the fact that he founded the PAN. I remember reading economic history years ago about the years right after the revolution. And there's this story which is extraordinary. I'm sure it's slightly embellished, but even embellished is extraordinary. Where in 1921, Gómez Morín is 24 years old, and he's already a high-ranking member of government. He's in New York as sort of the financial representative for the country in New York. And he's sent to negotiate Mexico's foreign debt, specifically with private holders at banks in New York, pretty much all by himself. Now, that's the part that is probably a little bit embellished, but he does lead these negotiations, and he does it magnificently well. No one wants to deal with Mexico after the revolution, and this 24-year-old just gets it done. And that's just the beginning of what will be a very long and illustrious career.
He's definitely the technocrat's technocrat, at least in an age when that wasn't really a term that was bandied around. People were still sort of messing around with positivism and all that. But I think he's a new breed. He's very much a man of the Mexican Revolution, right? He comes into his own. He becomes a sort of very vocal student, more or less, when the revolution is consolidated. So he's part of that system. He's part of the National University, which he would eventually come to lead. Kind of I think he's part of that revolutionary bandwagon, which sort of leads us to the first strange contradiction of the man he became, which is the creator of the main opposition party. And yet he's a man who's very much linked to the revolutionary government in its early days.
Definitely. And I think that's what's really weird about his entire career, where at least my reading of it is he's always involved with government or in government. He does very many things. He's one of the founders of the Mexican Central Bank, not with its current sort of constitutional mandate, but with the original formation of the Mexican Central Bank as we know it. He works for the Ministry of Finance. He works for the Ministry of Foreign Relations. He very much helps to construct the country as we know it. He's one of its many architects. And yet, consistently in his career, he's got, little tiffs here and there with the government. For the most extraordinary to me is he helps to write the constitution for the Mexican Central Bank. He's on the board of the Mexican Central Bank. And then the Mexican Central Bank, this was common at the time in central banks all around, was still sort of functioning as a commercial bank, not just as a regulatory institution and sort of inflation-focused institution, but as a commercial bank as well. He doesn't agree with this, and he throws a tantrum, basically, and he quits. And then he has a version of that years later when he's the dean of the rector of the UNAM. He's got multiple instances of this where he just says, this is the right way to do things. And despite him being part of the system and helping to create the system, whenever he has a strong disagreement, he will just rush out.
He's an interesting man. I think you've basically defined him. I'd define him in one word because I've said technocrat, but actually the very, very basis of his entire worldview is that overall and chiefly, he's an academic. There is a right way of doing things, and there is a way to move the country forward on the basis of logic. Sort of, if you just got rid of the politics, you'd just be able to have a really great country. And so you see him have those problems when it comes to politics, but also in the central bank, in the university, and throughout his entire life. We'll come to the moment when he's having a discussion with a future candidate for the Mexican presidency, José Vasconcelos, and how they have massive disagreements of how to proceed. And he basically parts ways with him on the very academic matter of whether or not it is the right historical moment for Mexico to have a candidate like Vasconcelos. I think there's an interesting, I guess, we could sort of go back to his early days, right? Sort of the pre-revolutionary era. He grows up in a strange part of Mexico at the time, which is the north, the far north, Chihuahua. Not strange because it's a particularly uninhabited place, although it is far less inhabited than it is now. But
Spoken
rather because
like a true Mexico City man.
Oh,
He came from outside of Mexico City, a weird place.
Weird and savage place. But I think it's fundamental to his upbringing because I think he was a lot more exposed to what we might call American culture now. He was educated initially, for example, in Protestant schools, and he had a different worldview. It's not an accident that the Mexican Revolution starts in the North, a place where they had far more access to rails than the South, maybe, and where they were more excluded from the sort of politicking of the center, where the center of power was.
And it's all quite tragic, really, his upbringing, because he loses his dad he doesn't really meet his dad, or at least has no memory of it. He loses his dad when he's I think a year old or not even a year old. And then his mother, who has basically no estate to her name, has to run around the country trying to do what's best for her son in an incredibly difficult time. Again, he's born in 1897. So she gets to live, well, the first years I suppose are fine, but then you get the revolution start in 1910, and it's an incredibly violent revolution. A lot of the violence happens in the north. So she slowly makes her way down with her son and makes it to Guanajuato, where he will receive education that's actually Catholic education. And I think this becomes particularly important going forward because religion is always an important part of his life.
Which shows the sort of transit from that sort of wild north where you have access to a far greater variety of ideas to the sort of more conservative center of the country where Catholic education is what's deemed proper.
Exactly. But in the spirits of the time, an educated man with a relatively conservative upbringing, at the end of the revolution and in the early days after the revolution, what should one study? He studies law. He goes to Mexico City to the National University, what will become the National Autonomous University, in which he will have a heavy hand. And he studies law there. And something interesting about him, he does all these very many things in politics, in academia, in culture, but he is a lawyer at heart and is a lawyer his entire life. He actually has his first offices in downtown Mexico City and will keep the exact same office for his entire life, always as a practicing lawyer.
I always wonder if Gómez Morín is a good example of educational determinism, because he's a man who's obsessed with the law, with academia, with doing things by the book. And I mean, he's an enormous nerd, clearly, and he's very into philosophy and economics and all that. But his core education is this legalistic education in a time when, I mean, in his own words, Mexico was ruled by revolutionaries who had no education and had no interest in having an education. So he sort of sees them with a large dose of disdain, which is carried out throughout his entire life and through every stage of his career, including the creation of El PAN.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because you say before that he breaks with Vasconcelos, but what's interesting, what he shares with Vasconcelos, now this presidential candidate, the important revolutionary thinker, creator of the Ministry of Education, just a heavyweight of Mexican 20th century history, they have more in common than they have not in common, right? Vasconcelos was very much on the same side of the debate. And when he creates the Ministry of Education and is creating the curricula for that, He is arguing that Mexicans should be, allowed to rise to the highest academic grounds, and they should be taught philosophy and literature. And he's fighting against this other current, the winning current, which is a lot more focused on being pragmatic and learning skills because, much more American, and by that I mean United States of America, much more focused on the economy and about learning things that are useful for the day to day. But I think in a very it mirrors the spirit of the times. I think there's a similar story with Lenin, where Lenin had ended so many friendships with other thinkers of his time who were also communists, who were part of the revolution, because they disagreed on the fine print of the second page of their manifesto without realizing that they were all on the same side.
I mean, it's a classic case of the communist left ripping itself apart over academic niceties, which is weird to think because Gómez Morín founds the National Action Party, which many years later is considered the traditional right-wing party of Mexico. Again, right, it brings us back to this idea that more than anything, this man is lawyerly. That's what he wants. He's clearly focused on the law and on the letter of the law and how it's being carried out in spirit. And I think this is the big schism that he has when he is in government, because when he's actually in the government, then this constitutes the first great schism that he has with the state, because when he is in government, he does a lot of things that you would assume are pretty right wing. Everyone knows about the fact that he was the lawyer for the Soviet Union, the sort of legal representative for the Soviet Union. But I think even more tellingly,
in Mexico, that is.
In Mexico, yes. But even more tellingly, and I think this strikes a more sensitive nerve nowadays, when he is in the finance ministry as an undersecretary, he introduces for the first time and forevermore, we still live with this today, Mexico's income tax, which now the libertarian wing and the right wing of the world completely rails against. It's against the freedom of the individual and the freedom to make money. But he's not a classic right-winger. In fact, what he's obsessed with is the letter of the revolutionary constitution. And that's where the schism comes from. The man breaks with the revolutionary government when he realizes, weirdly, insanely, that these politicians might be saying things that they don't actually believe and that they're not actually carrying out in government.
Could they?
Yeah.
You said it before and described it perfectly. The man is an academic, reads books, believes in books, and everything should be according to the books. And also, a corollary of that is the fact that he is willing to pursue any path so long as he can justify it logically and intellectually. And if that means ending up with a weird combination of left-wing ideas and right-wing ideas, he sort of didn't care for the most part. He's very committed to just being intellectually honest, independently of where that may take you.
Exactly. And that starts to create his political world vision as it became institutionalized in the PAN. So the first thing is the idea that technica, I mean, very technocratic word, but his exact words was like the use of technique from the sort of enlightened elites of the country are the things that can bring people together to carry out the true vision of the state. And so these are the people who have to carry out the Constitution's will, not these mad and violent generals with absolutely no idea what they're talking about.
But maybe going back a little bit, you touched on something briefly that I think is really, really important. You said that this man is very much in the spirit of the times of the revolution and revolutionary thought and against positivism. And I think that is at the heart of who he is and his philosophy. And that is something that he will carry to the end. And I think it is very much linked to why he founds the PAN and ends up allying himself with the sort of more religious right, even though he wasn't necessarily a right-wing man, purely said. The time during Porfirio Díaz, this is the dictator that runs Mexico up until 1910. It is his government that is ultimately overthrown in a way with the Mexican Revolution. His government was a positivist government. The people at the head of most ministries were called the scientists by many, precisely because they followed positivist thought. Now, in the wake of the revolution, many of Mexico's most notorious and most respected thinkers are anti-positivists. It's not just a purely Mexican thing. It's a thing that we see in many parts of the world. But Mexico was at the forefront of that in many ways, precisely because of the revolution. People like Diego Rivera, people like José Vasconcelos, who we mentioned before, and of course, Manuel Gómez Morín as well. What's tricky here is you have this positivism, and then you have, let's say, different facets of humanism and amongst other currents of thought that follow in response to positivism. But in parallel, you have another sort of school of thought, which is, again, this very pragmatic school of thought of just creating a functioning government. Let's say a Cicero's school of thought, where politics is the art of what's possible. Who cares if it's humanist or positivist? Just keep moving. Let's build this country. And I think that is what will define so much of his political vision once we actually get to the time of the founding of the PAN.
Yes, you get this weird combination that ends up being something like technical humanism, where he and then the PAN openly reject both the extremes of socialism, the collectivization of socialism, but also the brutality of capitalism. And they openly say that. So they're sort of born a third way, even before the third way actually exists.
It's sort of like an oxymoron, right? He's saying like we should have a positivist humanism in a way.
Exactly right. But he's still very much an academic at the time. He leaves government because he's sick and tired of all these contradictions. He literally he genuinely gets back into academia and eventually becomes the head of the UNAM, the National University, at a time when there's massive upheaval going on across the revolutionary landscape, namely the fact that the constitution is amended to say that education must become socialist. And that is the government now directly treading on Gómez Morin's toes as the head of the independent university, because the question becomes, should university education be socialist? And so I guess in a weird accident of history, if it had been a very capitalist and right-wing government like the Porfirio Diaz government, maybe we would have had a PAN that was left-wing from its inception. But because we had a revolutionary government that tended towards the left and the socialist left increasingly, he becomes a reactionary in the sense that he reacts to that political space and that political pressure. And so he starts pushing back. And what I think is interesting is we start seeing the old tools of government coming out. The government pushes back against the university and says, oh, don't worry, you're still autonomous. We're just going to cut your budget. And instead of letting the university die, he does a massive whip around, a fundraiser, where he works with lawyers, the private sector, and other institutions that are outside of the state, civil society, which again, right, start putting these ideas into his head of how a resistance to the state could emerge. This private sphere, this civil society that you could bank on to always back you up, even if they're not part of your movement. And by the way, the university survives.
And I think that's something that's incredibly interesting, because we talk of Gómez Morín as founder of the PAN, and the PAN comes with an enormous amount of baggage. It's unequivocally linked to Mexico's far right, and that doesn't always come with the best associations. But Gómez Morín is not focused on creating a right-wing party when he looks to create the PAN, where he begins to really shape the core of his political thought. Gómez Morín is a lot more interested, yes, as we've said before, in intellectual honesty, but he's very interested particularly in democracy. You talk about civil society. When he creates sort of the administrative norms that govern the UNAM, his aim in writing those is to ensure that the university runs in the most democratic way possible, autonomous from the influence of the government, but also that within it shouldn't be run by, let's say, a tyrant in the dean's office, but rather by a quite democratic system of across the entire university. And I think that's how he believed that government should be run in general.
Yeah, he's a sophist, but of course the university isn't the country of Mexico, right? It's the worst case study possible because it's just a government of academics by academics. But maybe academia is where he would have stayed had history not intervened, because in the year 1931, tragedy strikes when a religious fundamentalist murders the president-elect Álvaro Obregón just south of Mexico City. And it changes history. It changes history, not because the PAN is created, but it creates the conditions for Mexico to find a new way of governing itself. You see, when the president-elect is killed, what the governing powers, and namely President Plutarco Elías Calles, comes to realize is that this war will continue forever. The bloody part of the Mexican Revolution will never end if you don't institutionalize, if you don't create pacific ways of transferring power. And so, in a speech, in the wake of the death of Obregón, Plutarco Elías Calles comes out and says it is the time for institutions, it is the time for, he calls it, organic political parties. And this is a complete surprise to someone like Gómez Morín, who thought that the generals would never relinquish power. And so suddenly he's shot into action. He says, well, again, right, I'm going to take this man at his word. I'm going to start a new political process. What's interesting is the same political process happens on the revolutionary side, where the government, the revolutionary government, creates a new official party, the Party of the National Revolution, which would eventually become the PRI, which, as you said, was in power until the year 2000. On the other side, on the opposition side, you start getting a confluence of interests. You've got business people who didn't like the socialist bent of the revolutionary government, but most of all, you get academics, lawyers, and students coming to create a new movement, a new political organization called the National Action Party, or as it is known in Spanish, el PAN. But of course, this is Gómez Morín we're talking about. Instead of saying we're going to create a party where we're going to take on the government, he took a different road. And this is the debate that he has with Vasconcelos. Vasconcelos, man of action, says, I'm going to go out, I'm going to run for president, you're going to support me, and we're going to topple the revolutionary government in the election booth. And Gómez Morín says, oh, no, it isn't the right time. We need to create a movement. It has to be institutionalized, etc., right? He takes Galles's promise at face value. Of course, Vasconcelos goes out and proves Gómez Morín right. He gets crushed in the elections because there is massive fraud. Vasconcelos says, come on, everyone, let's take up arms against this government. And everyone goes, maybe not. I mean, we've had enough of war. And so he gets kicked out of the country and ends up in Europe. So that's the end of Vasconcelos. And yet we have Gómez Morín. What's he going to do?
And I think that's the thing with Gómez Morín. Like, it's very easy to sort of criticize him and say, he's not a man of action when compared to Vasconcelos. And yes, I think when you add it all up, he was overly biased towards, intellectual rigor as opposed to being a little bit more practical. But I think he was right at the end of the day. You're still having assassinations into the 1920s and early 30s. It's not a peaceful time in Mexico yet. And this lack of full peace and institutionalized control of the country will take quite some time to actually be implemented. And I think that's what Manuel Gómez Morín understood.
The problem is, of course, the man was way too biased towards the inaction side of the national action movement, because from the day one, he says, our goal isn't to win elections, it's to win over souls and minds. And you're like, I mean, that's great, but isn't the whole point of a political party to win elections, to get the people you don't want?
That's not the point, yeah.
Yeah. And that's sort of like the entire thing, right? This weird sophism. And in a weird and wonderful way for the PRI, the PRI, this is the perfect opposition party because they're almost designed to be useless, politically inefficient. So they're a great pressure valve for anyone who wants to sort of go against the government without actually going up in arms, but they never actually risk losing an election against the people. They're still going to, commit fraud and, repress the opposition. But the PAN, as the loyal opposition that is never really quite into winning elections, is the perfect counterweight to the sort of single party system of the PRI.
In that sense, they become sort of the loyal opposition, as I said before, of the PRI, which I don't think is what Gómez Morín actually wanted. I think he did want to, change hearts and minds to sort of take the country slowly but surely towards a more democratic path and so on. But the problem is that by creating a party of the opposition that never actually sought to win anything, that sort of legitimized the PRI. So it seemed that the PRI was being incredibly democratic because they allowed opposition to exist. The opposition just wasn't good enough.
In fact, there's a case in point, which is the exception that proves the rule, when the PAN years later in the 1970s says, that's it, we're sick of playing this game after literally 40 years of playing the game. We're not going to play the game. The government is actively interfering in elections. We're not going to participate. And so no opposition parties participate in that election. And it's a huge humiliation for the government because they win by 100%. And a central part of the one-party system in Mexico in the 20th century was the understanding that even though we all knew that the government was interfering, everyone still played the game. And if you stopped playing the game, it became apparent that Mexico wasn't a democracy. And so massive electoral reforms follow that sort of start opening the door to actual democratic practice in Mexico.
But then you've brought us into the 1970s, Alex, and something that happens is very important for this particular episode of this podcast is that in the 1970s, Manuel Gómez Morín dies at the age of 75.
Exactly right. But he leaves a massive legacy, and to a great extent, The PAN is the embodiment of who he was personally. Sure, he's institutionalized, but he's institutionalized himself, right? He's created an artifice that is very much personal. And in a way, that's a strange failure on the part of Gómez Morín, because instead of being this great plural and like diverse coalition, which it was in a sense, the structure, the central intelligentsia that run the party, tiny minority because they were very, very strict about who got to come in, it basically reflects him. And then you end up having this strange system in which, sure, the civil society, the churches, the businessmen, the community organizations will come out and campaign for you, but they're not really allowed in the party. And so you get the origins of this tiny nucleus of a party that is looking for success in massive elections. And they're a party that's very much linked to Gómez Morín personally. Even at the time of his death, he leaves behind his heirs, who are literally his family. And as soon as he goes, and as soon as his heirs sort of like start fighting amongst themselves, you start seeing one of the central issues of the PAN, which is actually the PAN is just a big family that is always the mesh in a family feud.
I think the problem with Gómez Morín is one of the many problems, despite him being a very respectable man, is that he, even though he really believed in democracy and creating a democratic country and so on, he sort of had a difficult time accepting people for whom democracy would look different to what he envisioned. So yes, of course he wanted plurality and debate so long as we were all heading in the direction that he thought was the right direction. But of course, if you create a party with that in mind, once you're gone, then you've sort of left the doors open for that sort of lack of plurality to be taken over by another voice saying, I'm the right voice and this is the only way we're going to do things.
There's a wonderful poll that was conducted at the time of Gómez Morín's death in the Mexico City suburb of Ciudad Satélite, very middle-class enclave, just northwest of the city. And what's fascinating is they're sort of a stronghold of the PAN. They're very middle class. They're very sort of pro-capitalist. And they went out and asked them what they thought about democracy. And they said, we're very for democracy. Are you against fraud and suppressing minorities? Absolutely. What do you think of indigenous people? Terrible. They shouldn't be given the vote. How about socialists? They should be stripped of their nationality. And so you see exactly the sort of mentality behind the Gómez Morín format of doing politics. Sure, very diverse in theory, but also as long as what the leader wants is being done, that diversity is accepted. But as soon as it isn't, the PAN goes into terrible civil war. And that's what we consistently see in the years after Gómez Morín. You get the rise of the Christian Democrats, who are the left wing of the PAN, funnily enough, and they get kicked out for being too religious, for being too left-wing, because that's not exactly what the founders and the leadership would have wanted. And it's only until the 1980s when you get the arrival of people who I think look a lot like the military men that Gómez Morín hated so much, which is the savages of the north. It's not my words. It's the words it was the term that was given at the time, los bárbaros del norte, who were the businessmen who made a concerted effort to take over the structures of the PAN to go on and win that election in the year 2000. So sure, the PAN wins in the year 2000, and yet you think, was it Gómez Morín's PAN that won that election in 2000?
Yeah, not at all. So Gómez Morín dies in 72, almost 30 years later, just 31 years later. Vicente Fox has taken the presidency in the year 2000, and Vicente Fox decides, as a man of the PAN who wins under the PAN, that he will decree, through presidential decree, that Gómez Morín was a great man and that he should be buried in what is called the cemetery for great people of Mexico that's in Mexico City. It's supposed to cement Gómez Morín's, eternal legacy as a great man of the country. The thing is, I don't think Gómez Morín could have stood Vicente Fox for more than 5 minutes. He was the complete opposite of what Gómez Morín actually believed in. Vicente Fox has many positive qualities, but being an academic and intellectually honest and so on is most certainly not one of them.
And sort of tragically, the way that he was very much like Gómez Morín was this idea of the sort of corporate structure, very small elite, leading the people who are organized for the purpose of this one enterprise, the election, and then dissolved. I will now do a bit of promotion because this chapter is very much explored in my book, La derecha no existe pero ya está, out in bookshops now. And it's a fascinating and tragic look into how the mind of this sort of like institutionalized anti-social movement works. Because what Vicente Fox does is the logical conclusion of the Gómez Morín structure, which is he mobilizes millions of people to win an election and then immediately dissolves his campaigning apparatus, which one thinks is very, dignified and stuff, civil society, let it be its own thing, and then is completely incapable of governing because he has absolutely no support from anywhere except for the tiny minority who surround him and the sort of like the money grubbers and the power hungry who start surrounding him because he's in power.
So in a way, very much like Gómez Morín's PAN, but accidentally.
Yes, exactly. In the most tragic way possible. And we get basically the dissolution of the PAN on the basis of its internal contradictions. But what's fascinating is that it still maintains a lot of that. Even today, it maintains a lot of what it used to be when it was founded. So you've got the fact that it's a very small cabal of people who run the second most powerful party in Congress, which means they get a ton of money. They still continue to rely on what they think is a silent majority that will support them. A thesis that might have been proved wrong when López Obrador beat them on every level, because the idea was the middle class will always support the PAN. And they didn't. They didn't come out and support them back then. And so I think that's the situation that the PAN is now in. They had this weird moment, a relaunch, where they had an AI version of Gómez Morín come out and say, keep fighting in my name. And I thought that was so telling because, of course, they didn't use Gómez Morín's own words. They used the bastardized AI version to, show that they're very modern and they're always about technique, but also completely throwing the sort of values of the party out of the window.
So sad, particularly because the man wrote widely. If you have no quotes by him, then okay, you can use AI. But he left a lot of stuff behind with a lot of his political thought. Like there was plenty of stuff that they could use. But I think what's particularly tragic in this juxtaposition of the PAN of Gómez Morín and not just the PAN of today, but the parties of today, is arguably the PAN has failed, right? They're falling apart. They might be the second most powerful, but there is another sort of right wing, many heads to it, that is rising. As you said, some of them already have more support than the PAN. And that is where the right is arguably and worryingly headed. And on the flip side, if you look at Morena is the complete opposite of Gómez Morín's PAN from the perspective of Gómez Morín wanting one way of doing things, pluralistic on paper, but de facto one way of doing things, versus Morena, who has taken power unequivocally throughout the country, mostly on the thesis of join us, we don't care what you believe in, we don't care where you come from. So long as you join this boat and wear this flag, you are welcome. And that's how they've taken the country.
And, all wearing the same colors and all signed up to the same organization, which is Morena. That's sort of like the central mission of the Morena leadership in this administration is to grow the party. At what cost? To what degree and with what people? Who cares? As long as the number is growing, that is good. And that's why they've become, at least according to them, the largest political party outside of the BJP in India and the Communist Party in China.
That sounds incredibly unlikely, but I'll let them have it.
Yeah, I have nothing to contradict them with.
So where does this leave us, Alex, on the legacy of Manuel Gómez Morín, this extraordinary man, and the party that he left behind?
It leaves us with an interesting opportunity, I think. The whole reason I wrote the book, the right doesn't exist, but there it is, La derecha no existe, pero ahí está, was to explore the state of Mexico's right. And what was fascinating was a lot of the history of Mexico's right is told through the PAN. And yet a lot of the people in the PAN consistently reject that they are right-wing. And if you talk about and understand Gómez Morín, you start to understand why those two statements exist, with the PAN being the traditional right-wing party of Mexico and a lot of its membership claiming, desperately assuring me that they are not right-wing. But the issue is that inherent contradiction is damaging to a party because it doesn't allow them, or it hasn't allowed them, to have ideological and programmatic consistency, which is anathema to what Gómez Morín believed in. So the end of the PAN could allow us, I think, to finally get a bit of clarity as to who is actually right-wing, and they could go off and form a right-wing party, which is very much like Morena, maybe, an anti-Gómez Morín, in that they will create large organizational parties, sort of mass parties with a single person at the helm, sort of the military style. And then it also opens up the space for the civil society-minded people who think of politics in a different way that maybe isn't about winning elections, but rather mobilizing these hearts and minds, maybe not in the form of a political party, maybe in a different way. But I think finally, I mean, the PAN isn't dead, and as I say, it's the second biggest party in Congress, but it definitely feels like a party on the down. And that, I think, opens up a few possibilities.
I guess we'll just have to wait to find out.
Until then.
This was Tavo Figueroa.
And I'm Alex Gonzalez Ormerod.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we're bringing you the people, places, and moments in history that made Mexico what it is.